We're here to talk about managing risk and share some sort of thoughts and best practice on how to do that in the context of our role as Woodcraft leaders. What I've thought of running through is just some reminders about the basic stuff that we're talking about, the kind of what the bare sodding minimum looks like, what we expect Woodcraft groups to comply with, what good practice might look like, and then finally some places that you can go for some more support and guidance on this. Very, very early doors, I'm not going to labour this, but this is part of a series around our approach to safeguarding, which is that very much broader kind of set of principles about everything we do to make Woodcraft a safe and stimulating place for young people to be and to be engaged. The stuff we will be talking about today sits mostly in that proactive, preventative domain, rather than in the specific sort of child protection area that people think of when we say safeguarding with a capital S, which is that stuff about responding to specific concerns about specific children, which has perhaps been the focus of our previous session, and particularly of the session that we will do in early December, which is about responding to and acting on concerns. So we are talking, when we talk about safeguarding, about that totality of everything we do within our groups and within our activities. When we talk about managing risk, what we're really talking about, and I think this is where our experience with managing risk in the Corona era has been really valuable, because sometimes we just think about, well, let's just control all the risks. With everything we do, it's about balancing risk against benefit. And I kind of feel I've written that sentence hundreds of times in lots of guidance about when to restart meeting face-to-face, because actually, if we waited until there was no risk, we would still be doing everything on Zoom, because it's still out there and it's still real. The National Youth Agency, Woodcraft Folk, all the other organisations that are providing youth work have taken the decision collectively that we are now at a point where the risks of continuing to not run youth work face-to-face is outweighed by the risks of going ahead. And I think that's perhaps been really quite helpful in terms of resetting our understanding of what risk is all about. So we're not looking to really completely eliminate risk, because if we did completely risk-free youth work, it would be bloody boring. We're looking to identify and control the risks. When we do that, an important part of that we'll talk about is recording and sharing the outcomes. I want to look a little bit at how we actually put those mitigation measures into practice, and perhaps some of the things that we need to be aware of when we're doing that, as well as the importance of reviewing what we're doing and revisiting it. There's a very helpful little pamphlet by a chap called Tim Gill, who's an outdoor ed person, which I'll provide the link to at the end. But it talks about exactly this spirit of balancing risks and benefit, and the title is Nothing Ventured. There's some wonderful quotes in there which I've just decided to start with. Judith Hackett, who was at the time the chair of the Health and Safety Executive, often they're the kind of the baddies of this piece because they're there with their big stick. Actually, the woman at the helm of that organisation said, if the next generation enter the workplace having been protected from all risk, they'll not be so much risk averse as completely risk naive. One of the things that we do, one of the important educational outcomes of what we do, is that children learn to manage their own risks, and they learn to exist in a world that is not completely risk-free. Also quoted in that Nothing Ventured document, Girl Guiding UK did some research, and one of the quotes they came out with from that report: over-anxious adults, exaggerated media coverage, and the inconsistent application of rules supposedly designed to keep girls safe have contributed to a climate of worry and misinformation. As a result, many girls, and I guess we can probably assume other young people, and young women are more concerned about statistically unlikely scenarios than genuine risks to their well-being. It's not saying that we've created a climate within youth work where we've removed all risks, but actually maybe we have tended to focus on the wrong ones, ones that are statistically unlikely, rather than the ones that are a clear and present danger to young people. And maybe that's the, another thing we need to think about when we're considering our risk is where the risk is actually coming from, as opposed to the things that we feel that we can write some good mitigation measures about. There are some broad categories of risks that you might think about. And if I could juggle two screens at once, we could try and categorize them. So there were some on there that were definitely environmental. They were about the physical security of the building, or about stuff that you might encounter there. There was stuff that was to do with the activity. There was bumped heads in games and people slipping on wet tea and things like that. There was definitely stuff in there that was about the needs of participants. I think there was one there about a child with SEN being overwhelmed by being in the group, for example. There was stuff about leaders and their interactions with the young people, maybe perhaps broader than spilling a cup of tea on a child, but there you are. But there was also stuff there about external factors, the weather, public, random adults, stranger danger, all of those sorts of things. So those might be kind of, if you're trying to make sure you've covered all the bases when you're thinking about the risks, those might be helpful prompts to think about, to make sure that you've identified a spread of genuine risks associated with the activity that you're doing, or the place that you are, or the people that you're doing it there with. Another thing that we've tended to think about is what's called hierarchy of control. So there are many ways that you can respond to a risk. You can either try and get rid of it altogether. That should say avoid the hazard. You can substitute it by providing an alternative. You can put in some sort of physical control so that people are distant from the thing that is causing the hazard. You can put in some sort of administrative control. So say only people who have been trained to do X will be able to do it. Or you can have some kind of physical protection. So this is kind of taken from an engineering sphere. But the same is true of the activities that we that we might do. Broadly speaking, there's a kind of hierarchy, because completely avoiding the activity is most effective, whereas putting in eye protection to make sure you don't get hurt is potentially less effective than having just not done that thing in the first place. That's not to say we should always be seeking to eliminate, as I said earlier, all risk. The right solution will be somewhere on that continuum based on a whole range of factors. I was thinking about this in the context of a session we did the other week. We had some lantern making activity and they all put their little candles in and we had the lanterns lit at the end. Mild danger, mild peril involved in that. We could have eliminated that by just not making lanterns, or making lanterns and not lighting them. We could have done some substitution by going, well, we're not going to use little tea lights because they get hot. We're going to use ultra safe but probably highly polluting electric battery operated tea lights. We could have put in some physical controls and said, right, when we light the tea lights, children are going to be a long way away, or you're going to only carry them on a string or whatever. What we actually did was said, right, when we light the lights, you're going to sit down behind them and you're not going to be running around while there's glass jars and hot things. So on that occasion, the administrative control was the right one for that comparatively mild peril. I suppose we could have gotten them all to wear fireproof gloves. That probably would have been a bit of overkill. So you can see how that's kind of, we could have avoided the danger by just not doing it. or making it as completely safe as we can, but actually to respond to that mild risk, that control measure was adequate. But that's just a kind of worked example of what those solutions might look like in different places. Our friends at the HSE talked about the risk assessment and the practice of doing that. They said exactly this: purpose of risk control is not the elimination of all risk. Striking the right balance does not mean that every aspect of play provision must be set out in copious paperwork as part of a misguided security blanket. The HSE are not encouraging us to use an approach to managing risk that is disproportionate to the activity that we're doing, or gets in the way of the outcomes we want to achieve with our children and young people. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of focus on. The balance we strike must be proportional and must enable us to work with the children and young people that we work with in a way that leads to the outcomes. Often we talk about that risk assessment as a thing. A risk assessment has to be done, and I've had, as a result of kind of people reopening their provision after a period of closure, I've seen more groups risk assessments than I've seen at any point in my time with the folk. Very often it's been a kind of, Owen's asked for a risk assessment, there must be one. Really, the document is just a record. I've seen it described as effectively it's like the minutes of a meeting. You would never write the minutes of a meeting in the absence of having the meeting. It's a record of a discussion, and that's what a risk assessment should be. Yes, it's there to provide evidence that you've done that, and in the event that something goes wrong, we can call on that and go, well, what was in place, what was supposed to happen, where did it go wrong? Or maybe it didn't go wrong, maybe something that was statistically unlikely happened, as it will from time to time. But having that record to fall back on helps us to reflect and to learn those lessons. But the important thing is that conversation happened. One of the most, one of the difficult things was reading risk assessments that had been clearly created by one person, based very closely on a template that I shared, with, not a great deal of confidence that that was what was actually going on in practice, because I could see the photos on the Facebook page at the same time, where none of those control measures were clearly happening. If it's not a record of effectively some agreements that you've made with your group, with the volunteers that you're working with, about how you're going to work together to keep everybody safe, then it's not the living, breathing document that it needs to be. The other important part of that is that then you are taking the outcome of that conversation that's been had by the people who are probably going to be leading or mostly responsible for that activity, and it's got to be shared, and everybody's got to understand what their part in that is. With volunteers, you might give it to them in writing, you might send it to them by email, you might upload it to group, or you might stick it in a Polly Pocket in the front of the group folder. If you're talking about young people, maybe you don't show them a physical risk assessment, but the things that are about them managing their behavior around something that's dangerous, like the fire, you talk to them and you involve them in that as part of your briefing for the activity. And that's, that's as important as having written it down, because that's the thing. No one was ever kept safe by a risk assessment that was in a file. They were kept safe because those things were done in practice on the ground. As a minimum, it should talk about what the risk is, who is at risk, and what are you doing about it. And that, that evidence, that paper document or electronic document should be clear who pulled it together and when that was pulled together. We make no requirement beyond that about what the format of that document is. use the format that works for you and for your group and for the volunteers that you work with and for the setting that you work in. It could be on a shared drive that everyone's got access to. It could be handwritten. It could be on a bit of flip chart stuck to the wall, as long as we can evidence that it's there. The essence of the risk assessment is not what it looks like, but what's the information that's contained within it. Often when we're talking about risk assessment, we have tended to talk about the idea of likelihood and severity being the two kind of the levers, the things that you're trying to measure. How likely is it to happen, and how bad would it be if it did? The official guidance, this is now in case law, that we are not expected to be trying to assess and mitigate risks that are either trivial, like, I don't know, nettle stings. They're a fact of being out in the countryside, unless you happen to know that you've got a child who's got an allergy to nettle stings, and that would be a very serious incident for them. A child getting mildly stung might make them a little bit miserable for a while, but they're going to survive. It's not going to have a lasting damage. And risks that are fanciful, you are not expected to think about rock falls, meteorite hits, unless there are strong indicators that that's likely. You do not need to worry about the Biblin's panther, by and large. Sometimes you will see people ascribing numerical values to those, sort of 1 to 5, and then you take one and you multiply the one by the other. You can put a high, medium, or low if that works for you, but it's not compulsory. There are, different things work for different people, and you should arrive at something that you're comfortable with. I think one of the things that has been pointed out, that if you have that kind of 1 to 5 and you do that multiplying it up thing, I've tended to find that quite useful, particularly because it sort of translates into some some kind of, you can make an adjustment about which are the most serious risks that you need to be focusing your attention on. The reality is that can kind of lull you into a bit of a sense that maybe there's a bit more science behind your rankings than there is in reality. And maybe it can make it feel like some things that are a little bit, finger in the air, are maybe giving a veneer of scientific rigor that perhaps isn't necessary, but also isn't appropriate for that document. So if that works for you, you can do it. If you're already doing it, by all means do, but it's not compulsory, and it's certainly not compulsory to be sitting there having a debate of is this a 3? Is this a 4? What's important is that you keep things under review. If you've said something's really unlikely, but it keeps happening week in, week out, you need to think about it. Maybe you need to either improve the things that you're doing to try and stop it happening, or maybe you just need to accept that it is a much more likely thing than you ever thought. I don't know. You might think that random individuals walking in and trying to disrupt your session in a public park would be quite unlikely, but if you keep finding the same bunch of teenagers in the park smoking rare herbs while you're trying to run an elfin session, maybe there's something you need to do about it. The other thing to factor in is the idea of dynamic risk assessment. Sometimes I'm a little suspicious, because it sometimes feels like, oh, we'll assess risk dynamically, is an excuse for not actually having the conversation beforehand and winging it. But however well you've assessed the risk in advance, there's always the factor of keeping your eyes and ears open and keeping your wits about you when you're doing it, because stuff changes. It might be that the weather changes when you're out on the moors. It might be that the road suddenly gets much busier than you're used to it being at that time of day. It might be that something happens and you need to respond quickly. However much you've written the plans in advance, there will always be the unexpected happening, and that's when that kind of idea of dynamic risk assessment, responding to the situation in front of you, communicating with your fellow leaders and making a quick snap decision about what the right thing to do is to keep everybody safe, is a really important part of that. And sometimes you'll see that written in people's risk assessments, that, you know, and we will continue, you know, as we walk on the moors, dynamic risk assessment will be used to make sure that we respond to any changes. You know, it's just a case of keeping your eyes and ears open, keeping your wits about you. Everyone happy with that so far, broadly? Great. So you will have seen possibly examples of, you know, risk assessments that are a bit like that. This is, you know, taken from some of the samples that we've been sharing previously. You know, these are documents that we've put out there in case they're useful to people. I personally find that kind of heat map thing quite helpful, but I think I'd also take on board the critique that, you know, what's a 3 compared to a 4 can feel a little bit arbitrary and a bit unscientific. Nobody's saying if you've got a risk assessment that looks like this already, tear it up. But I think as we, you know, as we evolve our understanding and our appetite to risk as an organization, we also evolve our understanding of what helps and what doesn't. The numbers are less important in this than the mitigation measures and how closely they link to the risks and the hazards that there are in place. I think, you know, one of the things that's helpful with this format is it does think about likelihood and severity being being 2 different things. They're in effect 2 levers that you can pull. Do your mitigation measures make it less likely, or do they reduce the impact if the thing was to happen, or do they do a bit of both? You know, if you've done something that mitigates the likelihood of it happening but doesn't do anything about the severity, is there something you can do to address that? If you see what I mean. You know, we can make it less likely for fire to break out, but we can also make it easier for everybody to get out uninjured if it does. To take an example, but actually a plan that didn't address both sides of that coin, if you were doing something that had a risk of fire, you know, elevated your risk of fire spreading, you'd need to address both. But I think, you know, there are some common and, you know, sort of fairly standard things that we might think about doing in most groups and most settings in here, but also lots of you are going to have risks that are quite specific to where you're meeting, or the nature of the community that you meet in, or sometimes the individuals that you have in your group who might get overwhelmed or respond negatively to a particular incident or stimulus. I remember we had the group I was working with, we had one child who was a notorious bolter. You know, the minute you got into open country, he would be off into the middle distance. You know, for a long time, that individual was named on our risk assessment as, like, if we're out in open country, they need to have one-to-one, because it was the only way that we could avoid having to call the police out. That's, you know, as long as that's handled sensitively and the documents, you know, shared on a need-to-know basis in that format, that's fine. If you've got children who have specific issues which mean that they need to be, you know, supported more than others, or anyone who's working with the group needs to be aware that they, you know, are likely to be affected more by something than someone else, that's also absolutely fine. So in terms of that kind of what's the minimum that Woodcraft folk expects, Woodcraft and our insurers in particular are very keen to make sure that there is a risk assessment in place for all activities. This does not mean that you have to rewrite that document every week. It's absolutely fine, and in fact very sensible to have a single risk assessment that covers your normal range of activities in your normal venue, whether that's indoors or outdoors, because the stuff that you do to keep people safe will be the same broadly, whatever you're doing within your normal range of activities, whoever's running the group, because it will be about making sure that that door is locked after 5 p.m. and making sure that the children don't run around near the chairs at the back because the caretaker gets pissed off. That's another thing to mention. Often we focus on the risk being about risk to life and limb. Yes, it's important that we mitigate risks to life and limb, but actually Woodcraft groups are threatened by other things like being kicked out of their venue. If you've got a grumpy caretaker and you do things regularly that piss the guy off, that's the kind of thing you do need to include on a risk assessment, because actually losing your venue would be potentially quite injurious to the group. If you're taking doing an additional activity that's outside of the normal range of things, you're doing a one-off session of bushcraft using lots of tools, or you're having a campfire in an outdoor venue and you're normally just stuck in the hall, that's the time when you would need to do a additional risk assessment for that activity and that venue. Similarly, if you're doing a camp, a residential, or a trip, that needs proportionally a risk assessment making of it, because that will be a different group of individuals, it will be a different group of volunteers, it will be potentially a different venue. That's not to say you can't base it on what you've done before. Every Woodcraft group, I think, will fall back on some tried and tested ways of making sure that they keep everybody safe and together and happy on camp. And that's one of the nice things about when we go away, is we very easily fall into patterns of, this is what we do and this is how we make sure that we add hot water to cold when we're putting out the washing up bowls and things like that. It's absolutely fine to base it on what you're doing before, but if you're using a different venue, if you've got a different person in charge of the food, if you've got a slightly younger age group, you need to make sure you're reviewing that and updating it and making sure it's all up to date and fit for purpose. Obviously, risk assessment documents in files don't help anybody. It needs to be shared with everybody who's there, everybody who's leading the activity, and everyone who's helping. And just a link to the stuff we talked about in the last session, make sure that it's consistent with your local safeguarding plan. It's not a substitute, but your local safeguarding plan will very likely have some broad statements about how in your group or district you manage behaviour. It will have some broad statements about the things that you do to make sure that parents are happy and that you're managing children coming and going from your group safely. It might say that you will, I don't know, elfins must always be picked up by a parent, pioneers can go home on their own if their parents have given consent, or whatever it is. So that document may inform parts of what you do in your risk assessment for your activities and for your group nights, to make sure that it all flows. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay. I thought just before we come to an end, and yeah, is that a hand up? Paulina, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, I think it might be good to just be clear on at what point do we class the obligation to have the risk assessment in place. But where if we're thinking about a trip or a camp, is it when people arrive at a car park where there's a coach? That situation where people arrive to a pickup point, is that something we risk assess, but not the journey to that pickup point?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because that's almost exactly what I was coming to on this slide. I kind of, as absolutely fine. I've no problem with people being ahead of me. I think practically, we need to be risk assessing from the point that we have responsibility for other people's children. You know, people driving. I mean, this has kind of come up a lot in the kind of Corona tide thing. People have been saying to me, but it says that, you know, you cannot. The youth work guidance says you cannot share. You cannot share a private car with someone from another household. I mean, not anymore, but it did. How do we stop it? You know, how do we stop people sharing lifts to Woodcraft? Well, you can't. There's a line of accountability where a parent hands their child over to you and puts them in your care, and you're in loco parentis, and they're often off the scene, although actually they might be, you know, they might be there and volunteering. If you've got two parents who happen to be volunteers, who've got an informal arrangement that they bring each other's kids on the sessions that they're not there, that's an informal arrangement. At the point where they're coming and being part of an organized activity, that's when we need to start being responsible. We need to start being accountable, and that's when our risk assessment would need to cover things. So if you are walking them as a group from the place that you normally meet to the swimming pool, yeah, you need to address the risks of how you're going to get them walking down the high street. If you're dropping them off at the swimming pool, or if they're being dropped off by parents at the swimming pool, you don't. Does that help? There's no hard and fast answer, because lots of groups do things very differently. Because, you know, some groups will always meet at the same place and put people on the coach provided by the same company, and it'll all be a well-oiled machine when they go to camp. Others will usually go quite locally and will have parents dropping off and giving lifts and so on and so forth. I'd say it is very much about the point at which we take charge of those young people. Where it gets tricky is because sometimes Woodcraft folk taking charge can involve the same people in the same combinations as them going out for a day out as a family. And we need to be in those situations, because, you know, people do take each other's children out informally. We need to be very clear whether that's happening as part of an organised Woodcraft activity that's open to all young people, or whether that's a private arrangement that's been made between a couple of individuals. So just to go back, when you're putting all of this stuff into practice, you should be trying to make it as simple and straightforward and transparent as possible. Again, as I say, being on the receiving end of people's risk assessments, I can't for the life of me understand why some groups have been going, well, here's our risk assessment for all the Corona risks, and then here's the risk assessment for being in our hall, and here's a separate document that's the risk assessment for the activities that we're going to just put it in one thing. You know, unless you're doing, you know, a program which involves, you know, lots of axe throwing and fire juggling and all sorts of things that our insurers would probably rather we didn't do. I can't conceive of a normal group program that couldn't be covered by a relatively standard generic risk assessment that contains, we will control the risks to do with some running around games, to do with some crafts, to do with some use of scissors, and, you know, and that's it. The idea that every species of activity you need, as well as then let's put a Corona overlay over the top of it, needs 4 different risk assessment documents. That just starts to get me concerned that actually the people that need to know what measures they're taking don't necessarily have the overview. For a group night, the perfect length for a risk assessment document is probably a couple of sides of A4. And if you think that, you know, you've got a group of volunteers who are going to read and retain much more than that, then you're either blessed with fantastic volunteers or you might be kidding yourself. Something to think about is how you involve the young people in that, both in terms of what do they have to do, but also in terms of identifying the risks themselves. We've done this with our pioneers and with our venturers. They're incredibly good when we talk about, you know, doing that. Let's collect the, you know, collect their ideas and plan out the program together. They can be brilliant if you say, right, give us the activity you want to do and give us a risk that you think is associated with it, and they can come up with, you know, and it's all part of that stuff that the Girl Guides were talking about earlier. They learn to manage and they learn to identify their own risks. They're going to be putting this stuff into practice themselves. If you've got young people who are taking a step up towards leading and directing their own activities, as they absolutely should be, encourage them and help them and support them as well to take a step towards keeping each other safe. And that's a really important part of the learning journey that they're on with us. It comes into the stuff that we talked about last session as well around local safeguarding plans, but making sure that parents are aware what the normal range of activities are, and what the controls that we put in place are. Maybe not sending them the full document, but going, you know, we are going for a walk. You need to be appropriately, you know, have your children in appropriate outdoor clothing, and making sure that the program, the range of normal activities is clear, is really important towards that kind of relationship management and making sure that you're not in a situation where if something goes wrong, because kids, you know, kids injure themselves, kids break bones, you know, with relative frequency, whether they're engaging in our activities or just, you know, hanging about. But what you don't want to be in a situation is where a parent is going, goodness me, how on earth did that happen? I had no idea that you were doing whatever it is that you were doing at the time when the accident occurred. And it's another of those kind of salutary lessons in why sharing that information about what is the program for the term, what are the normal things that we do, is really important and helpful to maintain those good relationships. It's really helpful to be clear, particularly if you're one of those sorts of groups where there's a shifting cast of characters who are volunteering. So it might be, you know, one person leading the activity who's not there for another term, or it might be, yeah, there's 2 or 3 people who are normally around. It's really helpful to be clear who's actually accountable, and that's one of the things that we need to be quite strong on. Everybody has a responsibility for all the children that are there, but actually who's making sure that those things are being done, those things are being followed. Maybe you can do that collectively. Maybe it's enough to just agree that that's the way that we do it around here, and we can all call each other out if we're worried that we're not following those. But most of the time, there will be somebody who is leading the activity. It needs to be clear who you need to be going to with a concern, or who you need to be asking about advice about how we make this thing safer, or, you know, sharing your concerns with. And I think when you've, you know, particularly when you've got larger groups of volunteers, which is particularly with our younger age groups, where you're going to, you know, you're going to have more volunteers around because you've got a group of, you know, ratio of 1 to 5 with your elfins, or 1 to 3 with your wood chips. It can be really helpful to just make sure that there are names, you know, on your rota, not just who are the 3 people who are here this week, but actually who's, you know, who's looking after the behavior, who's making sure that the activity's running, and who's watching the door, or, you know, whatever else it happens to be. So don't be afraid of that kind of, you know, trying to allocate, if there's specific things that need doing, allocate that to individuals. To kind of go into that thing Paulina was talking about, to be honest, most of our activities, most of the time, are mostly pretty safe. I have to say, from my experience, being the person who gets to see all the accident reports, where things go wrong is often on that boundaries. You know, it's not the activity that people were supposed to be doing. It's when the game finished and there was a tree and people climbed the tree while they were waiting for the next thing to happen, that a child falls out and breaks their arm. You know, it's not that running our sessions in the public park was inherently dangerous because the environment was really badly managed, but a child got bit by a dog just at the point where people were coming and going and dropping kids off, and you know, it's that sort of on the boundaries where maybe the leaders who are actually taking responsibility are not fully in the game because they're still preparing the activity, or they're having a conversation with a parent about how to pay subs and those sorts of things. Again, it's back to that thing about accountability. Well, maybe you need to have somebody on, you know, somebody on having random conversations with parents about admin, and somebody making sure that the children are immediately engaged in an activity. Maybe you need to know what happens at the end of the game in order to make sure that those between times are managed effectively. Maybe you need to be absolutely crystal clear about what time the session starts and at what point we take responsibility for your children. Maybe that's about, even if you're meeting in a public park, going, actually, we don't want you to come into the walled garden because that's where we're running the session, hand them over at the gate. Because we need to be clear about when we're responsible for your children. So yeah, it's those between times, those liminal spaces that I think sometimes can present some of the challenges to keeping young people safe in our activities, because it's the point where it's not clear who's in charge, it's not clear who's responsible, and therefore our ability to control the things that present the risk is less than it is when we're actually there and the children are engaged and you've got the right number of adults and there's no one there who shouldn't be. So it's particularly important in camp because there's much more between times. Things seldom go wrong when we're actually doing the activity. Things seldom go wrong when we're cooking. It's the bit in between where we're not quite sure and people are just hanging around that can sometimes be the challenge. And finally, when things happen, whether that's an accident, an incident, or whether it's a near miss, that's the time to reflect and go, did it all work fine and we were just unlucky? Or is there a lesson that we need to learn? Do we need to tighten up that? Do we need to do it differently? Yeah, absolutely review them, your standard risk assessment annually anyway. Make sure it's still fit for purpose, make sure everyone's still familiar with what it is. But at the point where something has gone wrong or nearly gone wrong, or at the point where something changes, that's the time to learn and to reflect and review. Just finally, I had a few of the things that I've referred to earlier. So the HSE have some very good guidance on play. When we publish this up on the website and then we've edited the video and stuff down, we'll put these as attachments on the bottom rather than you all have to go looking for them. Andy, who has just joined us as the head of centres, is a very helpful window into the world of outdoor education, and he comes to us from the Field Studies Council and has put us onto the Outdoor Education Advisors Panel, who've got lots of really helpful guidance documents, most of which I find just hugely reassuring about, building the case for why this stuff is good, why completely managing risk to the point that there is no risk associated with any activity is a fallacy, and talking about what is the minimum that a risk assessment should contain, what formats can you use, what are the actual legal requirements. There's some really interesting and useful stuff if you want to dive deeper into that on their website, and it's all drawn up by people who have huge numbers of years of experience in running outdoor activities, adventurous activities, climbing, gorge walking, all of that stuff, where the risks are potentially much higher than some of the relatively low-key bushcrafty activities that we might engage with. And then that pamphlet I mentioned earlier, Nothing Ventured, by a chap called Tim Gill, who's written extensively on this stuff and that kind of risk-benefit stuff, is on the English Outdoor Council website. That's well worth a look, again, if you want to read into more detail about this.